Well, yeah, thank you everybody and hello. My name is Jordana. I'm actually based in the labs here. I'm a postgraduate researcher. Today I'm just going to be talking about the importance of protein folding in humans. So this is the group that I'm based with, the research group. It's Professor Dario Alessi's research group. So what we actually study is Parkinson's disease. So you may have heard of Parkinson's disease. It's quite prevalent and it has an increase in incidence, and more people are being affected by Parkinson's disease. So we're quite interested because there's not a cure at the moment. It's just very much managed. So what happens in Parkinson's disease is we have a very healthy brain that becomes quite an unhealthy brain, and it's due to problems with the proteins. So this is part of the project that I'm looking at, is what's happening in Parkinson's disease with these proteins. Previously, I was a clinician and I worked in a hospital. I worked with patients with Parkinson's disease, and that's what got me interested. So I've come to Dundee to study that, with hope to help towards the management and potentially even a cure for the disease. So, just to start with, a question for you all. So our bodies are made up of 5 building blocks. Do you know what those 5 building blocks are? I have just mentioned one of them quite a lot. So any guesses? There's no silly guesses. Yes? Brain. No, the other thing that I mentioned, the brain's made up of them. The other thing that I mentioned a lot of. Yeah, protein. So protein's one of the 5 building blocks. Are there any others anyone can think of? Yeah. So cells are made up of the building blocks. And any other guesses? Okay. So, sorry, it was a bit of a difficult question. So proteins, spot on. So we see proteins mainly in the form of muscles, but there's lots of proteins within our bodies. Carbohydrates, we probably know these in terms of the foods that we eat, so your breads, your pastas, but they're really important in our cells as well for our cells to function properly. Water, we're made up of about 70% water. So lipids, they're probably more known to you as fats. Each cell has a lipid layer around it, and it keeps all the components in a cell, so it's really important. And the other one is nucleic acids. So these make up DNA. You've probably all heard of DNA. It makes us all what we are. It's the instructions, the blueprint of the cell. Right. So moving on from that, what actually is a protein? So a protein, it's just a long chain of amino acids. So have you all heard of amino acids? Yeah. So amino acids, there's different types of amino acids, and they all join together in different formations to make up the many different proteins within our bodies. So there are many different types of proteins, as I've said. So here's an example of one protein, is an enzyme. You've probably all heard of enzymes. So enzymes, they just speed things up in the body. So they allow 2 molecules or maybe other proteins to come together at a much faster rate. So they bring them together and they allow a product to be produced at a much faster rate to allow life to exist. So an analogy here is that you could have a look at his raw ingredients. The enzyme would bring all these together, so the pan. Then you bake this, and there's your product, is your cookies. The raw ingredient sat there is not really going to do much by itself. It needs to be brought together. So enzymes function mainly. A good example is metabolism. So when we eat foods, enzymes break all the food down, so we can metabolize that and produce energy. Another example of a protein, I'm sure you've all heard of the immune system. So the immune system is really important in fighting off infections. And the key protein in the immune system is called the antibody. So if we all had colds and flus and those horrible symptoms that we get, so when this happens, when we get some viruses or bacteria come into our body, these antibody proteins, a specific type of protein, they recognize these viruses and bacteria, and they mount an attack. So you can think of the antibody as the army that identifies the bad guys and mounts an attack to get rid of them. It's really important for us to be healthy. So there are many other types of proteins. I'm not going to go through all the different types of proteins. I'm sure you've heard quite a few of these anyway, such as the hormones, which send chemical messages throughout the body, your structural proteins, which I've mentioned, such as your muscles, and things like receptors and transporters. So transporters could be blood cells around the body, or obviously into and out of cells. But they're all really important, obviously, for us to function. But what makes up the key thing about all these different proteins is they have to be folded into their correct formation in order to work properly. So we have that chain, that this is the protein, which is made of the amino acids, which I mentioned at the start. So these have to be folded in order to be able to function. If they remain like in this formation here, they're no good to anybody. So we could think of that, for example, in terms of if we had some steel or maybe some carbon, in its normal form, it's not really any use. However, it can be folded, and if it produces a bike, for example, you've got something that's now functional. So just to give an idea. So where this takes place is in cells. So all protein folding will take place in the cells. So you can think of the cell as a bike factory, for example. And there are three main organelles involved in this protein folding. So the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum, and the Golgi apparatus. You may have heard of these already. So as I said already, so in the nucleus, this is where you have the instructions, say the blueprint. So it's the instructions to produce a protein, or in the case of a bike, it would be the instructions to produce the components of the bike. But as I said, in this form, it's not of any use. It needs to be folded. This takes place in the endoplasmic reticulum. So the protein will go to the endoplasmic reticulum. The bike parts will go there, and then you'll end up with your folded protein. So here's your folded protein. Here's your bike. At this stage, however, there just needs a few more modifications for the protein to be complete. So again, if we're thinking about the bike, do we want that to be, say, an off-road mountain bike? Do you want it to be a racing bike? So it will go through the Golgi. And in this case, it's got a bit of suspension, it's got some nice mud guards. So this is really well adapted now to go off-road biking with. The same with the protein. So the carbohydrates I mentioned earlier, some of these could be added in the Golgi, and it makes this protein very specific to then form its role. And this is really important. So unfortunately, what can happen is, in some cases, these proteins, they might not fold properly. So we end up with a misfolded protein. So this can obviously occur in some diseases. It makes the protein non-functional. So it can't progress to the Golgi to be modified, and it can't go and do its function. So we're going back to the bike. This bike obviously is folded incorrectly. You can't cycle on this bike. It's not going to perform its role. So in some cases, this is quite rare, the protein, it may be misfolded, but it may still be able to produce, to do a function. So for example, you probably won't want to go off-road biking on this, but you could probably get to A and B in a roundabout way on this bike. This is very, very rare. But the misfolded protein's function may be enhanced, so it may do its job a lot more effectively. So you end up with like a super bike. This is very rare, unfortunately. In most cases, this is what happens. You just end up with a misfolded protein that can't do its role. So this misfolded protein, it can be degraded, and so for example, the parts can be recycled back into back to be used to remake another bike, another protein. It can go back in the endoplasmic reticulum and be refolded again, so unfolded and refolded. However, it can also, as I've said, it can result in some diseases. Now, some of the diseases that are caused by misfolded proteins, you may have heard of these diseases. So Alzheimer's disease, so it's a very common type of dementia. So misfolded protein, it results in the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So your memory loss, it may have impaired motor function, impaired speech, for example, and it affects the whole brain. So you can imagine all the symptoms that are associated with that. Another disease is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So this is known as mad cow disease. It was quite topical about 15 years ago. This is very interesting because in this what happens is proteins start to misfold in an area of the brain, but it actually encourages proteins to then misfold in adjacent neurons. So it's like a domino effect, and within a year it can be very devastating for a patient, and again it will just affect the whole brain. And the one that I've mentioned already is the one that I study at the present. So this is Parkinson's disease. Now this affects one area of the brain. And it leads to, it's an area that's actually responsible for movement and, again, speech, swallow. So patients can end up with movement disorders. The reason why there's so much interest in these conditions is because there's no cure for anything at the moment. And so there's lots of, especially here at Dundee, lots of labs studying these conditions to see if we can help with that, maybe identify what's going on and help manage the symptoms. So thank you all very much for listening. So I know I've given you lots of information there about proteins. There are some little kits we've got to hand out. If you want one, you can collect one at the end. They're just protein folding kits that you can take away and have a look at in your own time. If you have any questions at all, it can be about the talk. It can be anything else to do with science if anyone wants to ask anything.